Cool. So I think we can kick off. Looks like we're going to get a regular influx of people, but that's okay. So yeah, good morning, everyone. Hope you're all well. Today, I'm here with John Mills. Just to introduce who we are. So I'm Sandeep. For those of you who don't know me, I run the product team at Webtrends Optimize. We are an experimentation platform. Hopefully, if our marketing's been doing all right, you may already know that. Yeah, I've been around for a fair while, 10-ish years here now. And yeah, just looking at what we build, what other people are up to, what technology allows us to do, and all those kind of, at least for me, interesting developer-y type things. But I'm here with John as well. John, if you want to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm John Mills. I'm the conversion rate optimization product owner at Community Fibre. So Community Fibre is a London-based ISP with the London's fastest full fibre network. We do lots to give back to the local community. I've been working in optimization, experimentation, CRO for about the last 10 to 15 years. And I've worked both agency side and client side. So I've kind of seen both sides of the coin and worked on lots of programs, set lots of things up. So I've seen loads of stuff around data and how it's used in lots and lots of different verticals. Some of the pitfalls and some of the interesting things and learnings that I'm hoping I can share with you today.
Excellent. Thanks, John. So yeah, today's topic is around North Star metrics and data quality and experimentation. And for us, at least on our side, this as a topic is quite interesting and quite relevant to what we're doing at the minute. For a few reasons, I guess. We've always been interested in the data side of things. More recently, aspects such as collection, cleansing, the ease of reporting and the consistency of it. These are all things that we're kind of looking into a lot more, having rebuilt our reporting engine and released it a few weeks back. So all these kind of things are always interesting to us. But alongside that are kind of the discussions that we have every day. We talk to a lot of customers, for example, who use their analytics tools, quite often GA, as a single source of truth, and whether or not these the numbers they're seeing are accurate and how well they compare to us is always a challenging conversation to have back and forth. So kind of getting things right, being very structured in how we deliver things to people. These are all kind of quite interesting things for us. But John, from your side, why was this topic the one that we chose out of the very long list that we had?
It's really tricky. As a topic, there's always lots of issues with data, and throughout my career, I've seen lots and lots of different things. So I've seen people using an analytics tool as a single source of truth. It's not necessarily set up the right way, but everyone kind of just believes it. And then the testing tool, for example, might have a different result. So there's lots of disparities between what you're doing there. I've seen teams measuring the same KPIs with different tools. And just kind of blindly accepting that works. I've seen tools not being calibrated, but just accepting that works as well. I've seen measuring the same KPIs, but in different ways. So one team might use users, one might use sessions or whatever. So there's always sort of different things that happen there, different impacts to it as well. And then just lots of other little pitfalls, like people adding things to GA without other people knowing if that's your data tool. And it's like, oh, why is that goal not looking the same as it should? And then I've seen things as well around attribution models. If different teams are measuring stuff in a different way, how do you prove the value to the business? How do you keep things consistent? And one of the pitfalls of this is making people or hoping people trust your data. If you're presenting test results and you've got 3 different teams that measure things in different ways, kind of questioning it, you end up with a kind of difficult situation in some businesses where you have to say, well, my data is right because of this reason, their data is right because of this reason, and so forth.
Yeah, trust in experimentation, I guess, is one of the biggest things. Quite often, what we report back to people is of significant business impact. if it's, this is the direction the site needs to go in, that's very relevant for product or IT teams, trickling all the way through to design and research as well. If it's a financial impact, again, we really do need to make sure the numbers are good and sound for whatever we choose to report back and the reasons why we choose those. So yeah, that all makes sense, and hopefully gives everyone here an insight as to, I think, why the topic was the one we chose and why we feel it's important to discuss today. The first thing to address then is the collection side of things, and I think just beginning with why it may not be as straightforward as people feel. And we've got a few examples of this just to highlight the fact. So try this for the first time. Hopefully it does work. So this is a Shopify store, fairly standard one by most sense, and it's got collections in the URL for its product listing pages. That's what this is here. What we then have is a product detail page, and it's got /product in the URL. So for most people building data collection on these pages, you go, okay, when it has collections in the URL, call it a collections page. When it has products in the URL, call it a product page. What we also find as a subtlety, and this is a very simple place and way in which you can get tripped up, is this as well. So you can have collections identified, but also products in the URL. And the only difference between the two is one extra item on a breadcrumb. So in this scenario, it's an additional rule to think about. If it has products in the URL, it's always a product page, regardless of whether or not it has collections. So a very simple thing, but if you don't realize these pages exist and all you ever see is these and these, then it's very easy straight away for your collection to be wrong. And then if you're looking at things like, bounce rate off a PLP, how many people go and browse deeper and look further, it's very easy for your collection to be wrong on the very first instant. One other example of things that we see and why, collection is not always very straightforward is this. So let's just say we wanted to track people who clicked on our search, right? Pretty straightforward thing to ask for by most kind of standards. So if we just put the ID as something we can easily identify and look at the mobile version of the site, we take what looks like the same search bar. Here we can see it's got an old ID. And if we scroll up, this is our desktop version. So there is a mobile version, and you can kind of look higher and it is identified. This is desktop only. There is a mobile version lower down, tablet. But, these kind of things, if you don't realize they're happening, it's very easy to say, well, why are my clicks not quite what I thought? Or if you're kind of reporting clicks back to people, why are those numbers not reflecting what's actually happening on the site? These are very easy, very basic things, obviously much more advanced reasons as well, why collection might be difficult. But John, from your side, I guess collection has not always been the easiest of things either.
It's not, there's another side to the collection as well. That once you've collected the data, understanding what you've collected and what it's actually telling you. So for me, one of the things that's always interesting is the data you've collected. Is that, firstly, is it the right data, as you've mentioned, but then is the result you're seeing part of a promotion? Is it because of something you've changed on the site or outside factors as well? So there's always these bits to consider when you're collecting data, like what are you actually reporting on and how do you mitigate that?
Yeah, that makes sense. So looking at what people should do about it then, might as well just let you lead, John. I think you've got a good few ideas of, I guess, structure, right?
So key things for me, I think with any data collection is making sure that the QA is spot on. So I've seen lots and lots of different approaches to QA, but one of the key things is actually QAing it properly and going through QA the metrics as well. I've worked in places where it's like the developer says it looked great in browser stack, so it works. It's like use real devices if you can, make sure you've got everything there, and try and set up a QA framework if possible. So one of the things I like to use, if I can use them, is a test script where when you're designing your test, I think Sandeep, you might have a slide with an example of a test script. So what I tend to do is try and explain what the test is, how to activate it, and what the changes are. So you've effectively got a checklist. You can check that as you go through that, that's what the test does, that's how it works. You can give that to the developer to build against, and then the QA can go through and effectively check off each step, so we know that's what should be happening. And then if you refer back, if something doesn't work, you've still got that. If you need to re-QA it, you can kind of go through again and go, right, this is what I did last time, this is why I saw it didn't work, and keep going through. And then you get a much better idea that the data collection and that everything is working correctly.
Yeah, I think test scripts are something, even in kind of what we would refer to as mature agencies, I don't see it done all the time. And quite often, it's a very easy thing to not do, kind of not be very clear about how people get enrolled in the test, what they have to do to trigger things, and exactly what journeys they would end up taking to track, the metrics that you're interested in. But when you don't do it, kind of assume everything is down to interpretation. And if from our side at least, I think the most valuable thing we see is consistency between what's handed to a developer, what's handed to QA, and eventually what a client and users end up doing on the site. So if you have these test scripts, and these are the things which you plan way beforehand, at the same time that you're documenting your project. These are things that are handed to a developer. And in that moment, there is agreement that says, this is how we expect users to be enrolled in the test, how we expect them to trigger these metrics. And if a developer sees differences as they're building a test, you iterate on it. You kind of refine this as you go along. But the idea is that you have a single source of truth, not from the data sense, but, for how we're building our tests, between dev, QA, and everything that happens afterwards as well. And if you do that and a bug arises or a scenario pops up, there's at least accountability all the way back down that tree to say, was it documented? If not, fair enough, these things happen, but at least we know. If it was, then why were there so many stages in between or before things went live where these things weren't caught? I think these are the reasons why things like test scripts, things like good documentation are kind of really invaluable. From our side, we also look at things like journey mapping. I think with a lot of people we work with on the client side, quite often they will have the site in front of them, but they don't themselves know how people get from a step to another. That kind of analysis isn't necessarily the easiest to do, and quite often it's kind of pushed to a side in favor of very straightforward things that people can run at. But from our side, looking at things like even asking yourself very straightforward questions, who can get here? How did they get here? What might they see when they get here? Really, really straightforward things. But that almost lets you identify paths on the website or groups of people who might see something a little bit different to each other. And if the answer is always it's the same group of people and we don't do anything special, great, at least you know. But the only way you get there is by making sure those questions get asked, and early on, ideally long before a developer writes a single line of code, or, before you build those tests in a WYSIWYG editor. Got a question from Cameron as well, which feels relevant. So how would you use a test script on a testing tool like SiteSpect, because they have a preview bar which shows which metrics are firing? I think most tools nowadays will show you which metrics are firing in some shape or form. There should be some way of getting that information back to you, either in their console or on the page itself. And the question almost isn't which metrics are firing, so much as have you thought about when they could fire? If it's entry to the test, have you given enough consideration to what you would even count as a user or a view or an entry to your test? If it's people getting to a certain page, are there several ways in which they could get there? And have you made sure you've captured all of these avenues? These are the things which it's great to have testing tools feed back to you as early and as quickly as possible to say, by the way, we've noticed that we've, triggered this metric for you. But it's more about the journey to get there. These are things that quite often get lost, especially in translation. If you have an agency, for example, there might be 3, 4 people who kind of have touch points on a test at any given time.
Yeah, exactly. I think one of the key things, as you were saying, Sandeep, is around how you fire those metrics. And just because the tool tells you that something's fired, you haven't necessarily seen each of the different journeys to trigger those metrics. So if you use the test script idea of like, actually, here's this journey you might not have thought of, it means that the QA has got a much kind of clearer route of how to trigger those metrics to fire in the tool.
Yep. So hopefully that addresses that one. Moving on then to kind of why, what you should report on. It's not always clear. Sometimes a lot of people will use a single metric, and that's great. But when you have competing teams of people, quite often, and I know, John, we were talking about this as well, it's not always very clear, or people have their opinions, shall we say, on, what you should be reporting on. So yeah, from your side, why is it difficult looking at what we should be reporting on?
Well, there's obviously different business requirements. Some different teams have different budgets as well. So there's a lot of things that they kind of look at there. And there's also, things that are, things that are important to us as like optimizers aren't necessarily important to like the C-level, C-suite and people like that. So it's really hard to get that balance right of where are the things that we should measure, how do we measure them, what's the important thing that's going to drive the business forward, and giving the right people the right information that they need.
Yeah, I think quite often what we'll see is things like some teams perhaps, running paid search campaigns are tasked with reducing bounce rate. That's kind of a metric that we get a lot of. We want to reduce bounce rate, and quite often we look at it and say, cool, we can do that and we can measure that and understand the impact, and that's fine. But what for? And when we look at what we should be doing about these things, I think John had a good kind of example with goal trees of, if you're looking at bounce rate, that's great, but what are you actually doing it for? So do you want to explain the world of goal trees?
Yeah, sure. There's a few different approaches to goal trees, and I'm sure if you look them up, you'll find different articles and different ways to do them. One of the ways I try and do it is look at all of the different kind of key metrics or key journey points across the site and work out which metric each of those things feed. I don't know if you've got a little screenshot you can share, Sandeep. So it's a really helpful way of identifying which lever you can pull effectively. So I've put this together. This is kind of a fake thing for just an average e-commerce site, but you can see at the bottom, if we're trying to get more people to sign up for a newsletter or download a brochure, what does that actually do? What's the next thing we want them to do? So we want them to come back. We want them to progress to like a PDP, for example. But actually, if the user's at the PDP, where's the value? What does that actually add to the business? What are we trying to get them to do? If they're on the PDP, we want them to add to basket. So we can start to see how each of those things track up and go to, at the top for an e-commerce site, I've put revenue, for example, but what drives the revenue? So it would be transactions, average order value, basket size, number of items in the basket. So we could start saying here, well, actually, we know those 3, basket size, transactions, average order value, are what drives revenue. So instead of trying to focus on just revenue, what would be our key metric? Well, we could pick any of those 3 and say we want to improve those. And then how do we do it? Well, we want to get more people into the checkout funnel, possibly opt into marketing as well, so that they can do different things in the checkout funnel, and so forth. So we can kind of go up and down, and we can see how each of those different items or different levers can move people towards our kind of North Star metric or our key goal.
Yeah, and there's a lot of reasons why the first time I saw this, I thought it was excellent. So if you look at, people with lower traffic sites, for example, or even people who are just trying to move a lot faster than, you'd kind of get from traditional testing cycles. Having proxy metrics are quite a good, at least indication of what may happen. So if, for example, we understand that, people entering a journey or people looking at certain things or, filling up a basket to a certain size almost certainly leads to something. Whether or not that something happens or you capture it in the volume you need to then report back on significance, you have earlier proxy metrics which can kind of predict what will happen over time downstream. Um, for lower traffic sites, this is quite useful. I've heard people like the testing team at Spotify talk about this as well, and Facebook, where it's kind of, we can say with certainty that if we see these early indicators move in a certain way, we understand what that's going to do to our final goals that we're interested in. So I think from that side, at least, things are very interesting here. And the other side is almost kind of full funnel accountability. It's very easy to say, let's play with the obvious things. I think a lot of people, at least a good few years ago, were bought into this idea of make your KPI the most obvious, the closest thing, so that we're all running significant tests. And apparently that's a very good thing. But in reality, if you're observing these very early stage things, people who visit a PLP, download a brochure, sign up for a newsletter, whatever the kind of very early goals are. If you're observing them, but your goal is still to encourage people to buy more, spend more, do more, um, then you should at least have view of what's going on down there. And that is your real goal. The early things are almost secondary metrics. It would be great to drive up downloads or get more people browsing. But at the end of the day, your goal hasn't changed, which is still to get people to spend more through whichever of these kind of avenues they take, whether it's buy more things or have higher value goods or more profitable goods or whatever it might be.
Yeah, I think one other thing I like to add on that is that you can use this to sort of build out a reporting framework. So as you were saying, Sandeep, you can start to say, we have got more people to download brochures. How has it affected the transaction metric, or how has that affected the add to basket metric? So if you start to get a consistent measure of, or a consistent framework of how those metrics are affected, you can always consistently report back to the business and say, we did this and this is the impact. It hasn't moved this needle, but it's moved this, and we can kind of start moving people around and understanding what's going on. And then you've got a consistent story to tell that's always focused on those kind of key metrics at the top of the funnel.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the key things that's useful, when you're taking this kind of structured framework approach that we're talking about today is almost not making it up as you go along. Quite often we'll see people where all the results are in front of you, and then you'll say, "Ooh, let's look at this metric, and this is the one that's gone up, and therefore that's the one that we'll be reporting back on." But it's almost taking that step back and saying, we have this structure, we have this framework, and this is what we're going to be reporting by. For better or worse, there is a good reason why we've landed where we have. So putting that structure around things. So, looking forward a little bit further then on where to report. Um, I think even that as a question is a very challenging thing nowadays. For example, a lot of people will say, I do all my reporting in my analytics tool. That's my single source of truth. But I think even that as a statement or a way of working is not always straightforward. So, as an example, we worked and still do with quite a well-known travel brand. And what we found was that their bot traffic was considerably high, and it wasn't something they were necessarily aware of. Um, and these bots happened to be blocking GA. So in GA, there was a massive black hole almost, of traffic of people, perhaps even on sophisticated devices where it looks like, they are very genuine. But yeah, GA being blocked, or perhaps with ad blockers as well, and a lot of people using those, but essentially people not falling into GA, so the numbers weren't genuine in terms of what's actually happening on the site, but they were falling into a testing tool. So, the numbers naturally get imbalanced, and the question is there to say, why are you over-reporting in terms of what we look at on GA? And it was being able to, or having to, kind of tie users one by one, look at all the transactions and say, at what point do we decide these are genuine or they aren't genuine people? If people are running ad block and managing to block GA, that doesn't stop them from being genuine users, but yeah, it's still a, valid reason for someone to fall into an experiment. So, whether it's that or saying, let me look at my session recording tools and my insight tools, I think there's so many different places nowadays where we have data. And so this whole idea of, where do I even report on my test is quite challenging. But, looking at what people can do about it, I think there's quite a bit. Testing tools, I think nowadays are a well, perhaps from a biased point of view, given who we are and what we do. But where we usually start is say, let's get the data close enough between our single source of truth, the analytics and experimentation, and kind of just agree that the data is fine. For so long, the two are, quite far away from each other, sometimes for valid reasons, like I mentioned, sometimes not so. But once we understand that we can trust the collection in the experimentation tool, at least for me, it feels like that's the right place to go and report your metrics. It's the only place where you get the statistics that you're after, the correct metrics. Entry to the test isn't something that you have to relay to another tool. It's there as, the first point of collection. But what are your thoughts on where to report, John?
So one of the things I try and do is consider like the time to insight. So it's great to get all the data from your testing tool, get the analytics. You can look at how they marry up. You can look at the session replay. But when you kind of break it down, no matter how deep you dive, do you get the answer straight away from the testing tool that this increased transactions, for example? If that's the quickest way to get the insight, and no matter how deep you dive in the analytics tool, why spend that much time doing it? You can find some useful stuff if you do that, but we're all very busy. We have a lot of stuff we need to do. So I try and focus on the testing tool, and then if there's some data that I need that isn't available in the testing tool, then just look at those other sources. But always make sure that the testing tool, at least for me, is the kind of single source of truth for those key metrics, and then any additional stuff is look at the other tools to just kind of complement that and just make sure you can tell the story consistently.
Cool. Yeah, that certainly makes sense on our side. And looking not just at, where to report, but I think there's also a very tricky question we have, which is when do you even stop your test? And this is very difficult because sometimes people will say, stop my test early. Sometimes I think we found that, tools will almost tell you, hey, your key metric is significant, and these kind of things as well, right, John? What have you seen?
Yeah, I've seen quite a few things. I've seen testing tools that will kind of, there you go, have a winner as Sandeep's put on the screen, which is great. Tells you there's a winner, but actually when you look at that, is there enough data to start segmenting? Like, is that statistically significant? If you want to break that down and start having a look at what's happened to, say, mobile users, etc., it's really important to make sure you've got enough data in there to do that. So don't always trust the tool. And sometimes the tools do things like you can see on the screen. You had a winner, but due to changes in traffic behavior, the winner is no longer valid. So, you have to understand your data and be able to look at that and go, right, does this actually tell me what I need? Do I believe it?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think there's an interesting question, at least for people who use the kind of Bayesian way of understanding significance, which is, almost how much is enough. A lot of people rely on this kind of 95% number and say, when it reaches that or it goes above, I feel confident in what I'm seeing and therefore I can report that back to business. But, what is the actual difference in real terms between 94% and 95? If you see 94 or 93 and it kind of just hangs around that number, is your test all of a sudden not valid? These are the kind of difficult decisions I think that we need to understand when we're looking at data. It's almost when is really the right time to switch off.
Yeah, there's
Um,
go ahead, Sandeep, sorry.
no, go on.
I was going to say there's also the question of risk versus reward. And different businesses have different approaches to that. Some people are quite risk averse. Some businesses are really like, we need the data to be really accurate. Others can, be it play with a little bit more risk, but there's things like non-inferiority tests and being able to say, we know this is not worse than what we have. And if we've designed something that we think that the user experience is better and the data is like, it looks like it's probably not going to be worse, do we go with that? And again, it's kind of down, it's a difficult business conversation, but it's it is even an 85% significance. Are we happy that it's close enough to be better? How much risk are we going to take with that?
Yeah, as long as your potential risk is as small as possible, perhaps with enough data, you'll be able to say with certainty, hey, this definitely does look like it's better, and perhaps you're not there yet. But if your risk is very small to go ahead and deploy the advancement, is there any reason to stick with it for a very long time, perhaps even months or longer, just to make sure you hit that magical number? I think the more we look at these things, the more we understand, we have a sample size, we have a direction that we're aiming for. And then it's just about data. The more we see, the more we can pull together, the more of an informed decision we can make. But having things like risk or potential loss as something you measure as well as the benefit is always a handy indicator as to whether or not to jump forward. So finally moving forward, hopefully we can squeeze this in. But looking at what we report back to a business, and why it's important almost to be very consistent in how you approach this. So, it's very difficult, especially when the nature of testing sometimes is ad hoc. People come over to you and say, hey, can we experiment on this thing? And perhaps you've not had very long to think about it. Sometimes, as we mentioned, the metrics that they're after or wanting to improve are not necessarily the ones you would use as well all the time. But in terms of the consistency of what you report back, John, these are not very straightforward things all the time, right?
They're not. So there's a few different approaches to this as well. And one of the key things that I try and do is, we've talked about having different teams reporting on different metrics and so forth. We've talked about having a kind of single source of truth. So if it's from the testing tool, for example, make sure you have that, kind of own it, explain why you use that, why that's the best thing to use. And then you can also use the goal trees we've already talked about as well to say, right, these are the metrics I'm reporting on. This is where they're coming from. This is why I'm reporting on it. This is why it's important to you as a person that's reading the data or receiving the insights that I'm sharing. So as long as you can kind of spell that out, it's quite important, and just make sure you're consistent and you own it. But there's a few things to decide when you do that. So, make sure you know how you're going to measure these like key metrics. Make sure you know why you're going to measure them. Make sure you know where you're going to measure them, like as we said, which tools. And then know why you're doing it as well, so you're able to talk about it if anyone questions it. Another way to do that is just making sure you have a single source of truth, which is kind of like your own truth. So you've defined everything, you've shared with the business why you're doing something a certain way, but you always kind of stick with that. Don't chop and change, and don't change how you report that stuff as well. Doing this gives you good control over your data as well. And one of the key things, I've made some very rudimentary slides to illustrate an example of being consistent. One of the things I find really useful is having a specific style that you can then share with the business, that after a while people will understand this is your report, this is what it looks like, these are the key things to find. So as Sandeep's put on the screen, I've seen things where one month or one test has the previous one, which is kind of like a nice illustrated slide with some data on it. Then the next one is, as you can see on the screen, completely different layout, and then there's different data. So when you start sharing stuff like that, people don't really know what it is or how to read it. They have to kind of relearn it. So if you create something that's consistent and you can own it, I don't know, Sandeep, can you jump onto the next slide? This is, it's not a great example, but it will show you, a little bit of design, so you can say it's yours and keep it consistent. So you've got your dates there, you can link to your data sources to give a bit of extra validity so people can go and find out the data and where it's from, and then just keep it consistent for everything that you're doing. It will help build trust in your reports. It will enable you to see if your data gets used in other places because you've kind of created your own style. Gives you a really consistent way to tell the story, and importantly, assume that you're not always going to be there when someone else is, when reading your data. So by having a consistent style, if anything comes up, you're in much more control over how that's presented and perceived.
Yeah, and I think one of the key things, which is very good for people who run programs at speed, is almost taking the subjectivity out of what we do. It's not to say, why are we doing this? Well, because someone decided to, or we didn't think too hard about it. Why are we tracking these metrics? Oh, because I felt like these were the ones that I wanted to care about today. But if there's always a very consistent way in which you report back to people and you say, look, as a business, here are the goals that matter to us, no matter what we test and no matter why we're testing, these are always the things that we're going to report back on. It's a very consistent way in which everyone can have the same goal. From there, the results are the results, and you almost take that subjectivity out of things where you can say, well, this metric, which I feel is important, is up, and therefore it's a winner. It's almost stepping away from the winner, and it's just about data. How does what you're seeing influence where you go next? We have made this change. We saw this in the same metrics that we use all the time, and therefore it's guiding us in this direction for what we do next. I think kind of, taking away the bias from, there are kind of several touch points in experimentation for where things can be biased, but almost pulling those away at any opportunity you can get is always good. And the examples like John put together for us are certainly an excellent way of making that happen. In the interest of time, I think it'd be good to wrap up and perhaps just kind of share with you a few key things to think about then. John, were there, maybe a key point or two key message that we should leave with people?
Yeah, sure. First thing for me, super important, get your QA in order. Make sure you're doing the most robust QA you can, because if you've got type 1 or type 2 errors in your data, people aren't going to trust it. So make sure you're happy that the QA is great and that the results you're getting are accurate. And then look at things like goal trees, kind of journey mapping, and ways to make sure you've got consistent metrics that you can trust and kind of report on.
Yeah, that sounds good. And yeah, from our side, it's just about bias. The more consistency, the more structure you put around things, whether it's, what you hand to your developer and you say, here's what we're looking to build, but here's how you get to the page. Here are the specific transformations. Here are the various states of the page. Consistency in that messaging, or as we're talking about today with how we report back on things. The more consistent we are, the less we are likely to influence what you see as a result of a test. And, with a lot of these decisions, they're very passionate. Sometimes people are very invested in a test doing well. So you almost want to say that's excellent, and we're glad that's the case. But let's almost put emotion aside and say, very consistently, here is what we're going to be reporting back on and how we're doing it, no matter what project we feed through this similar mechanism. So yeah, hopefully that was useful for people. We do have a few more questions. I've not thought about them in too much depth, so we're just going to fire them up and we'll see how far we can get. So Marlon's asking us, what's our recommendations on data collection in the context of experimentation and consent for analytics? The challenge being only a partial view of data. From what we've seen, at least as a vendor, opting in felt like a very challenging, very troublesome thing back when it landed with people a few years back. This idea of forced opt-in, consent prior to being able to run experiments. In practice, as the kind of heat and the emotion settled down a bit, I think what we've seen in practice is quite often it only kind of really hurts experimentation on those initial pages. If it's a homepage test or landing page test, and people haven't opted in yet, their initial view of what they see quite often is the only thing that really gets hurt. Different tools will always have different views of data. So as long as you're happy that in an ideal world, what you're seeing is accurate, the tools are not losing data, shall we say, then the comparison between them almost doesn't matter. And it's just, my experimentation tool is the best place to report on my experiments. And that's where we should be looking. If there's doubt over the tools, that's the only place things are tricky, and that's what we try and kind of head off as early as possible.
Yeah, I can add to that. Obviously, part of the question was that you only get a partial view of the data, but certainly in my experience, it may be a partial view, but it's still a very big chunk of the data. So you have to just make that decision and go, yes, maybe 10-15% of users opted out and we weren't able to get the data that way, but we still know it's the majority of our users, and you kind of have to do the best you can.
Absolutely. Got another question. We'll try and deal with one or two more. We're pretty much past the time that we allotted, but just given the questions are with us. So Gary asks us, how do you see machine learning or narrow AI assisting in the reduction of the human error element in CRO while incorporating things like test scripts and goal trees? AI for us is a really interesting part of what we're looking to do in the next 6 to 12 months. So at least we can happily discuss the impact or, what would happen. So for us, I think the biggest human error we see quite often is when people are trying to piece things together by themselves. If you're scanning, for example, dozens of segments trying to find insight, or you don't really know where to look, and so you start off looking at device type, and then perhaps there are some other obvious things like how people got to the site, or kind of obvious things, and then where do you go from there? The more of these things you do, the more numbers you look at, the more easily confused we are. Scanning tables and tables full of numbers is a very straining thing to do. I certainly don't envy any analyst, John included, for having to spend a lot of their time just staring at tables and numbers and waiting for reports to load. And it's very easy in that situation to make mistakes. So I think for us as a vendor, at least, one of the biggest opportunities we see with things like machine learning is almost scanning that data for you, hundreds, thousands of times even, and saying, here are all the insights or the avenues, you should consider looking down. In practice, what that means is you're not wasting your time looking at things of no relevance. If device type is doing nothing for you and they're all exactly as expected, why bother taking the time to look down that route? Every single report, every screen you look at, you're going to be less and less effective, less and less accurate, more prone to making mistakes. So if there are only 2 or 3 places where something interesting is happening, perhaps the machine not saying or forcing with certainty and saying, just go and report this back without even looking or thinking about it, but just pushing you in that direction and saying, there is definitely something interesting going on here. Spend your time here and not over there. For us, at least, that's kind of where machine learning does a very good, useful job, is almost taking that grunt work away from people. And that's, at least in the near term, I think, where a lot of this human error, just from being tired, not because we're not good at what we do, but just we're trying to do it 100 or 1,000 times for dozens of tests, and these things naturally take their toll. That's I think where we see the key benefit. John, have you seen much machine learning come across?
I've seen it a few bits. There's I don't want to go too far away from the question. I think one of the key things I've seen when I've done some machine learning before with CRO stuff is getting data back that is significant and is accurate, but then you can't really use it. So there's the making sure that the machine isn't giving you stuff you can't use as well. So there's that piece. Like I had something that came back and it said, if you serve this variant at 12 o'clock on a Wednesday to new users, you will get more sales. But how do I do that? Do I run
Is the
something for an
CMS
hour?
even equipped to go and do something like that? Or is the
Exactly.
testing tool lightweight enough to do 1,000 of those type of very granular things? Yeah, that's always very difficult.
And then, yeah, I think going back to Gary's question, incorporating test scripts and goal trees, there's things you can automate with like the QA and using test scripts and saying, like, sending bots to have a look at stuff and how it renders on the page and how that's different from what you expect. But again, the human element's probably the safest version for it, certainly for QA, and just seeing how another user will kind of understand that.
Excellent. There are a few more questions here. I think with these things, it's always tricky to to know when to stop a webinar in this case instead of just an experiment. But I think given we've run past our 45 minutes or so, we'll call it there. I do try and answer these other bits and pieces that come through on LinkedIn. So just because we haven't managed to get to it today, and John and I have rambled on for a bit longer than we perhaps needed to, doesn't mean they won't get answered. We'll just try and pick them up separately on LinkedIn, and perhaps we can have a more back and forth discussion with you as well, instead of it just being one way answers coming to you. But yeah, thank you all. Hopefully you found this useful, and the idea of kind of putting structure around the way in which you report and things, as well as appreciating data collection and why it's difficult, and why good QA is very important to what you do. These things are kind of impressed upon you a little bit more than perhaps it was when you joined us. But yeah, thank you all. Hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the sunshine if you're in the UK. It's unseasonably warm. And yeah, take care. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.